Welcome to our latest edition of Bold Agendas, where we dive deep into the transformative forces shaping business, leadership, and the future of work. Today's episode, we explore what it takes for organizations to build capabilities needed to remain competitive in an era of digital transformation, AI acceleration, and evolving workforce dynamics. To help us navigate this conversation, I'm joined by Karl Johnson, Global Head of the Strategic Capabilities Practice at Mars Incorporated. Karl is a seasoned expert in organizational design and transformation, talent strategy, and leadership development. His work focuses on ensuring that businesses build the right capabilities to adapt, thrive, and lead in a rapidly changing environment. I'm Mimi Brooks, and this is Bold Agendas, Strategic Capabilities at the Epicenter of Organizational Design. Let's get started. Karl, welcome to Bold Agendas. Thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to have you.
Thrilled to be here, Mimi. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course, I love it. So before I jump into the conversation, can I just ask where you align in the organization? Where is strategic capabilities? Is it part of the HR organization at Mars, Karl? Or let me let you give people a bit of an orientation in terms of where you are there.
Sure, it's a great question. These types of groups can sit in many different places in an organization, sometimes between strategy and the organization.
Right.
In this instance, we're a COE that sits within the HR organization alongside the culture, talent, rewards folks. So that's where we sit.
And how long has it been a defined COE there, Karl? For a while since you came in, did it start with you? Did it pre-exist you?
Yeah, there's an interesting history. I'm glad you asked about this. The COE was actually stood up about 3 or 4 years ago, and as something of an experiment. And so what Mars did was brought together some really high potential HR talent and some learning people, and stepped into considering strategic capabilities through that lens. And then I was brought into the organization a couple of years ago. And the intent there was to make this into a more holistic offering, get into the areas of org design, op model, transformation, things of that nature. So it's still a relatively new organization within Mars. And it's already gone through, a couple shifts since it was first stood up.
Karl, I was particularly interested in speaking with you about this because in our own work, our own transformation work at LDS, when we're doing long-term transformation planning and trying to anticipate the changing nature of work, over transformation periods, 2 to 5 years usually, our methodology has evolved over about the same amount of time that you're talking about to be very capability centric. So we look at capabilities as a progression of organizational capabilities needed over time in order to express, if you will, the transformative impacts on the organization. So that sounds kind of aligned to what it is that you might be doing here as well.
Yeah? Very similar. And probably like yourself, Mimi, we define organizational capabilities as some combination of operating model, organizational structure, processes and ways of working, how work moves through the organization, talent, and culture. So we're looking across all of those domains and assessing within a capability, what are the different factors across those domains that come together to create that organizational capability. And one thing I'll mention too is capability means something different to almost anybody. So one of the challenges about speaking about capabilities is, and especially with that heritage that I just mentioned, folks can think of capabilities as people capabilities, personal capabilities, skills. So we have to be really clear about the domain we're talking about at this organizational level, at the systemic level, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I like the language that you're using in terms of the associated domains. It almost seems like they would ladder up to the concept of, the organizational systems and structures that would be involved, right, in the evolution of work. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And Karl, just to come all the way around the circle on this, strategic workforce planning, then, associated with this function as part of, OD work, or how would you see that?
Yeah. I don't know how
Yeah.
you intuited this, but when the team first stood up, because it was more people focused, HRBPs, which we would call PNOBPs, and learning people, from the outset, they started assessing skills, and we're doing that in the context of strategic workforce planning. So for a couple of years, we were piloting SWP with different groups across the organization. And right now, we are essentially establishing an enterprise-wide approach to SWP. And as we talk a little bit more today, it's very similar, and it's a part of capabilities, right? It's this talent piece that we're analyzing. So that is a capability that our team is building out for all of Mars right now. And it's very tied to everything we're going to talk about today, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, you'll laugh about this because just coincidentally, I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who teaches at NYU, and she teaches in a strategic analytics program as part of the human capital professional studies there. And I said something to her about strategic workforce planning because she has done that for years. She was in PepsiCo before she went into academia. She's going to be a guest on the show one of these days soon, hopefully. And so I said strategic workforce planning. And she said, we're starting to say strategic work planning. I thought that was very interesting because what she's trying to drive is this concept that HR needs the context of work redesign in order to anticipate strategic workforce, planning and to do the capability assessment and building that you're describing. So a little bit of a line of sight, perhaps, to how you might think about it.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I mean, a lot of the workforce planning is we start with skills are part of it. It was a principal part of the way the team approached it originally, but we're really looking at what's the work that needs to be done in the organization. Therefore, what are the people we need? When do we need them? Where do they need to be? And what are the skills they're bringing to bear? That type of thing. So yeah, very similar, approach. Sounds like.
I thought it might be. Oh, perfect. So Karl, let me kind of start at the beginning of this because I think at least in my own work and the comment you made a moment ago that capabilities are not, I think it's not common language for business leaders to be using when they think about it as building blocks, of the future workforce. Other things roll off, much easier than that. Culture, for example, skills, for example, but capabilities, I think not so much. So maybe we can just slow down for a moment, let you kind of talk to me about, why you see capabilities as an epicenter of this discussion. And then maybe give me a little bit around methodology that, you might be using as you think about, assessing, recommending, aligning capabilities to future business needs.
Yeah. So you're right about capabilities. And that's why it's often useful to break it down into those domains. So when we're assessing capabilities, the questions we're asking are things like, when we're doing the internal piece, and then when we're looking externally for, what is going to be needed 3 years from now, because we're always lining up with strategies. So we're always starting with the vantage point of what in 2 to 3 years from now are the capabilities that are going to be required, and then establishing what our baseline is today, and then understanding what's the path that we're going to take to develop the capabilities over time to reach that 3-year or 2-year horizon. Increasingly, the horizon's getting a little shorter to 2 years.
I know. Yeah. It's going to be almost like real-time constant planning as opposed to target planning, right?
Right. And so that helps leaders, takes it out of this theoretical OD speak around capabilities when we actually get down to these tangibles for them. But I will say one of the things that's really helped is, I brought into the group this framework, and it's really a pyramid. And so in terms of getting leaders focused and actually knowing which way to go in terms of capabilities, we use this pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid are what we call necessary capabilities. So these are really table stakes. They're required to remain a viable organization. In a company that's not a finance tech, fintech company or a banking company, your finance group might be a necessary capability. So it's very important. So this isn't pejorative. The top is not better than the bottom. All of them are required to be a viable organization. But at this necessary capability level, the game is really to maintain them at the lowest level of investment to remain a viable organization. So that helps business leaders in terms of, prioritizing from an investment and
that makes sense.
Energy. At the center of the triangle, or the middle of the pyramid, are core capabilities. And these are important to customers, and their performance impacts satisfaction. So there's some degree of interaction with the customer experience that's involved with these core capabilities. However, they're not what's providing a clear basis for competitive advantage. And so in this instance, when you get to that investment conversation, it's how do we maintain them at a level that satisfies the customer and that keeps us at parity with our competitors? But going beyond parity is inefficient. So what we want to do is tie the investment to maintaining these over time. So again, we can do that forward, back, 2-3 year view. They will change over time, but it's not really our secret sauce in terms of how we compete. So I can give you an example here. I was working a few years ago with an automotive supplier, and what they had done was they had done a really good job of, they used rolled steel to create bumpers, and they were able to create these incredibly light bumpers that could compete with the other materials that bumpers are made of, and they were actually stronger. But the challenge was they didn't have parity with their competitors. So to meet and become a tier 1 provider for the automotive manufacturers, they didn't have sureties of supply on a global level. So the automotive suppliers are saying, like, look, if you really want to partner with us on a global basis and elevate your partnership with us, you have to build out the surety of supply on a global level. So we did things like establishing a joint venture to get there quickly, helped them with their org design to become a global organization, things like that, just to get those core capabilities set so that they can continue to be a viable competitor at maybe a little different level. Strategic capabilities sit at the top. And these are the capabilities that are the most meaningful for customers. And at the end of the day, they're the basis for competitive advantage in the marketplace. So they're the ones to prioritize when it comes to investment, attention, and continuous improvement. So if I use that automotive supplier example again, what their strategic capabilities included was new product development. And it was real interesting. We had to look back to discover this, and we looked back over their history. And when they founded the company, what they were doing was creating steel pipe. And so they had developed new product development, customer insights, R&D, mechanical engineering, prototyping. These type of bases for new product development capability. And when the market started to dry up in that pipe area, they were able to transition over to become an automotive supplier. So these are enduring capabilities that really put you in sight of really what your secret sauce is. And so when you walk senior leaders through that type of pyramid framework and some of the stories that I told, it really helps get people focused on what we're talking about, both defining capabilities and where they sit in a hierarchy like that.
So it's a simple model, right, Karl? I mean, it's an easy way to kind of understand it. Certainly, business leaders know what their points of differentiation either are or need to be. So you're not posing a HR question or a theoretical question that I've got to interpret it into my business model. So it's kind of an easy way for business leaders to think about prioritization, creates a good, kind of basis. So what happens with this model? Of course, I'm drawing it out as you're
Yeah.
talking to me because I draw out everything. What happens to this model over time? How does transformation affect this model? I could guess, but I'm going to let you tell me.
Well, I mean, we do transformation work in all these domains, right? As part of a large transformation at a former employer where we were building out the data function, which would be a necessary capability, 3-year transformation. It's good to know what domain you're playing in, and so it helps in that manner. But I actually in the strategic capabilities space, there's a lot of literature. There's folks, C.K. Prahalad, Gary Hamel, the author Jim Collins. They've centered in on this idea with different language around really get clear about what your source of competitive advantage is. But I'll tell you, when we get senior leaders together, it's a pretty vibrant discussion, when you start to categorize those. And it really increases awareness to get a focus and force people to name and describe what they believe are those strategic capabilities. And it drives a lot of clarity. And what I see is, we talked about the investment. How are you going to prioritize investments? If you're talking in the strategic capability space, it makes it a lot easier to make a business case to secure the investment you need against those capabilities. And the innovation space, it's clear you should be doing that in terms of focus on capabilities. But they're a really good yardstick for all types of business decisions. So
Yeah.
when we look at
what not to do as well, right, Karl? What not to do as well as clearly as what to do. I simple thing to say, but I actually think it's really quite challenging.
Yeah. And so the things you shouldn't do is we often work leaders through a discussion of what their product and services mix is. And if they've got products and services that can't maximize the advantage of these strategic capabilities, it's a pretty good indication that those need to go, because they're draining investment and they're draining focus and energy away from what really is the
good point.
And also acquisitions. And so, as you know, people love to fall in love with acquisitions with different business cases around it. But really, you should only acquire an organization that can take advantage or enhance your strategic capabilities. And they help identify where to invest. So if you've got parts of the business that don't align with these strategic capabilities, they're really a distraction and they really do better. They'd be worth more to other companies, and it's best to divest and reinvest into what's really driving your competitive advantage.
Karl, I have just I want to drill this down into other models that leaders might be familiar with that could be confusing to them. But before I do that, I just want to get the line of sight of prioritized business capabilities to the operating model. How would you connect those dots for business leaders for them to see, the related idea of that?
Well, it goes to where you need those capabilities, obviously. So where you locate them relative to your customers. So there's a lot around, are we able to deliver these capabilities locally, versus centralized, things of that nature on the operating model. And a lot's about governance, is oftentimes the governance in the organization isn't optimizing use and deployment of all of the capabilities that we talked about. So, it does back us into the reevaluation of what's the operating model, the structure, the processes, all of that, the culture, things of that nature, in terms of are those aligned to and set up to bring those capabilities to bear in service of the customer. So that's the perspective we take. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. So it would be common if I said this then, right, Karl? It would be common that if you were consulting with business leaders or, a leader inside the organization around this planning process, that you might be looking at implications to the operating model, both how it's informing what you're doing and how what you're doing could be impactful to it
Yeah,
as part of your process, if you will.
that's absolutely right. We're
Yeah.
looking across the entire system and understanding what are the tweaks, the changes, and making decisions, as I'm sure you do in your projects. Is this going to be a phased implementation, a one and done? What's it mean in terms of this 2 to 3 year, business strategy timeline, things of that nature. But we are never playing in just one domain. We're never just looking at operating model or structure or processes or culture or talent. We're always looking across and seeking to identify where there are gaps relative to what's needed on a necessary core or strategic capability level to keep the business competitive.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Karl, in order to be holistic in terms of the recommendations that you make, of course. But I'm wondering, when you say that, what you found in kind of a practical sense that might be confusing to business leaders when you come in with this, holistic approach, centered on a discussion around 2B capabilities. And I mean, things like even in our own work, when we get involved doing transformation planning, which covers all the domains that you're referring to as well. And sometimes what we run into are, models that sit in just one domain, a culture model or context. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And those individual domain, plans or focus then become not necessarily great fits when you put it all together. And I'm just wondering, do you see that? Do you see these, almost isolated assessments that might happen, in certain areas? It seems to me to be common in culture.
Yeah.
And go ahead. Let you tell me what you see.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about the culture space in particular. Probably like you, for years, leaders have come to me and said, "I want to shift my culture." And the model I use with them is basically a 4-quadrant model. You could also view it as a circle. So in the upper left-hand box of those quadrants, it's really about individual mindsets, values, things of that nature. So that's the starting point with any of this work. And so what we're really looking to do is to many times shift mindsets. And there's a reason why one starts there. And these can be all different types of mindsets. We are living with a industrial era, revolution mindset, right? An idea around how companies do need to be organized, how they are compartmentalized. That mindset loves to break things down to the lowest common denominator, huge emphasis on skills, and consulting companies that are, selling a skills approach to organizations. Because it fits with this paradigm of, if we break things down to their smallest piece, we can then rebuild them, because we're architects and we've got a blueprint, and these are the bricks in the wall, which doesn't take into consideration that halfway through building the wall, the landscape's changed, So it imparts this degree of inflexibility. So that's one sort of mindset that's really interesting, which is, are people trapped and they can't see a more systemic view? And that's important, because when it starts with mindset, it then defines what's going to happen in these other domains. So the upper right domain is language and behavior. And thought precedes language and behavior. So your mindset's going to define what that language is and what the behaviors look like. And we're in this imperfect human paradigm, kind of like the shadows in Plato's cave, where I never know really what's going on up here for you, Mimi. I can only look to your behavior and your language to try to understand that. So that's the part of the work that a lot of culture consultancy groups tend to do really well. And I'll say that I've looked at the histories of many of them, and really what they are is communications, advertising, kind of a marketing background bent to them, which means they're really good at defining a message. They play well with senior business leaders in terms of helping them model the language and the behaviors that they need to impart trust that this is a true organizational culture shift, and these folks are all modeling that. Where they
Yeah.
fall down is in the rest of these boxes. The bottom right box is things that seem to be more visible or tangible to people in organizations. That's when we get into the org design, the operating model, the processes, KPIs, performance recognition that's tied, to incentives. That's where those consultancies fall down, because to be sustainable, the culture shift has to be reflected, and shifts need to be made, usually in all of those domains, for the culture shift to be sustainable. So what I used to and still do tell leaders is, you're talking about culture, which is the lower left box, but culture is a lagging indicator of what you've done relative to mindset, which then informs behaviors and language, which then informs how an organization is designed across of all of these other areas. So I have really good things to say about people that are consulting, but by and large, they're missing a big part of the equation, which is why groups like ours, maybe like yours, need to be coupled up with them to ensure that we're really aligning these other parts, that define how the operation gets work done, to what the culture shift's going to be for it to be sustainable. I mean, you can do all the communications, that stuff, but over time, if you don't shift these other things, it's not going to sustain.
And that second box, Karl, really is the most common one, right? That you see kind of pulled out from the model, much more so than the others. I don't see the others anywhere near as much. And it almost seems that, some concepts, in recent years, leadership concepts have given that some juice, right? Ideas like, strategy narratives, common storytelling ideas. So a lot of this is, what are the leaders saying? How are they modeling, if you will, this culture aligned to strategy? It seems to manifest itself with a big center of gravity there.
Yeah.
Is that how you see it?
I think it's true. And, the best work is done not by the leaders, but it's people within the organization. So if we're engaged in culture work, what we're really looking at is people 2 or 3 layers down. And they're great tools like ONA, Organizational Network Analysis, which will tell you who the hubs are in the social network that sits behind the org chart. And it's really important to get those people engaged and included in any transformation. But in the instance of culture, what we're really looking for is, what's the language of the people in the organization? Not my language, not the leader's language. We really want for those not just to have the right story, but it to be in the words of the people that are going to live that storyline. And the best way to do that is to bring them together, workshop them, and have them describe those pieces of the culture that need to shift.
Where ambassadorship really matters, right, Karl? I mean, I think that's true in every business that I can think of that we've been involved in, but I think it's really true in operations-centric businesses that are very frontline oriented. The people on the front line, just drive so much in terms of the work of work, right? And they live the work of work, and they know it.
Well, I had the benefit, years ago, I used to run executive development programs out of business schools, and I was at UC Berkeley, and it was really interesting. The marketing department had some very forward thinkers. Rashi Glazer was one. And what they understood was the culture and the brand need to be the same. Essentially, if you're really delivering against the customer promise, there's going to be an incredible amount of correlation between what the culture in the organization is and the value you bring to that customer interaction.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. So, Karl, if I can look at that in the context of the work that you do, because, you're an internal consultant, essentially, right? I mean, that's how your services, your expertise would be applied.
Yep.
So, what happens to the whole if you're working with part of the organization, but not all of the organization, especially to the degree that Mars may or may not be an integrated business model? I'm not sure of what it is, so I'll let you tell me.
Well,
But
yeah.
so what happens when you're working with pieces of the organization, but maybe not the whole? If that is in fact a situation you find yourself in.
Yeah. I'll try to answer Mimi and push me on this a bit. But Mars is much closer to a holding company than an integrated enterprise.
Okay.
And so the business groups are really large. It's a $70 billion organization. And we have whole different business models within that. We have a whole part of our organization in the pet space that is a service model. They're running veterinary health clinics. They're the largest veterinary health clinic system in the U.S. So we've got the service model. And then we've got snacking, which is the candy bars and things of that nature that people know us for, Wrigley, et cetera. Also in the pet domain, we have pet nutrition, so Ives and Pedigree and other pet foods, Royal Canin. And then we have a food group that's really more about entrees and center of the plate things in terms of meals. That's a growing business for Mars. So they are differentiated and they are separate, but they all sit upon the same necessary capabilities in terms of what we would call commercial, which is, supply and supply chain and all of these types of finance, et cetera. So we've got that typical, core centralized functions that are generally our necessary capabilities, maybe even up the core that we're interacting with. So push me a little bit further on this.
So when you're working with your internal business clients, would you tend to be focused on a line of business or a BU holistically, Karl? Or would you tend to be down into, a piece of that business unit, if you will? And that's kind of what I'm asking is, wouldn't it be difficult to be looking at pieces of a business unit without looking at the business unit or, operating unit in its entirety relative to organizational capabilities, especially as work becomes more horizontal? I'm thinking about the redesign of work itself, more horizontal, more cross-functional, more collaborative, et cetera. So just, how you see that relative to the work that you do.
Yeah, that's correct. We do both. So in large transformations, they're tending to be holistic across the business group, global, and of that nature. And yes, we can inform all the smaller parts of the business by the op model or design, et cetera, type of work we're doing, culture. When we get down in the business, one of the things that's nice about being internal is we live with our leaders over time, and so we get to know the business really well. And we get to know how things get done at Mars. So in some ways, we can take the attributes that we're working on the macro level, and also inform across different businesses. So we can subtly, oftentimes we don't even tell people we're borrowing what we've done in other parts of the business, because there might actually be resistance. They might
good point.
They kind of want an invented here type of approach. But where we can, Mimi, we really are trying to connect the macro level work with what's happening in the organization. And sometimes we're letting people in those smaller we're giving them visibility to the direction that the business is going, which is incredibly helpful for them. So it doesn't go the opposite way. We're not going to do those pieces and inform the whole. That doesn't happen very often. But if we do have the overall context, we can really help those pieces of the business to fit into it in the current. But again, sometimes the future state, they're not quite aware to the level and degree that we are of what that future is going to look like, and where they fit in this capabilities mix relative to that holistic work we're doing.
So, Karl, when is, so you mentioned some of the advantages of being inside. Of course, all the context of the business, your relationships are evergreen, they're not episodic, What's the downside? How is being an internal consultant at times, not the advantage?
Yeah. And I've been both. So it's easy to compare. The downsides are when you're external, somebody has a problem and they call you, and you get in to work with them. They're calling you because they view you as an expert. And so we get a bit diminished as it's just the nature. It's not Mars. It's every company I've been internal at is, you really need to prove yourself, create your credibility. So, and it's just the typical way to do that, which is, really research the business really well and show up for those first meetings with really good questions. Because the way people evaluate you really is, at least in my approach, it's about the questions you ask. Because once you start asking those deep questions and drilling down on each one of them, then the ears perk up, the eyes widen, the leaders start to lean in. They go, okay, these folks have done this before. They know what they're doing. You start to establish that credibility. So I would say that's actually the major disadvantage, is just in that opening stage. And also, rightly so, the organizations do need to go out and get external perspective. So a lot of times in our work, folks have been working with the large management consulting firms who bring that outside perspective. They're operating across so many different businesses that they bring a fresh perspective. They kind of get start to sow the field ahead of us. But what we're really good at doing in those instances is taking their work, docking up to whatever stage they've been through. So in org design, maybe they've laid out the first level of leaders, things of that nature. And then we say, okay, we'll take it from here. And we know at this stage, all of the parties that need to be involved, how you actually roll this out within an organization like Mars, where shirts.
So it's a win-win. Yeah. It's a win-win. It's not insular. You get the, best ideas, and then you can operationalize it probably more efficiently and effectively, once you take the handoff. So do you ever, just out of curiosity, go outside and get, outside help to augment your team, or does it tend to, be people that were hired, by the business leader, and then you come in collaborating and figuring out, how to transition?
Yeah. I mean, we're at Mars, the team is quite small, really probably about 10, 12 consultants,
Okay.
So of necessity, if you're going to manage a large transformation, I've, in other organizations, last organization I was with, I had about, 15 to 20 internal FTE consultants. And at any given time, we had 20 to 40 external consultants that were coming in and augmenting the team. So it can be this mix. And so oftentimes we're standing out teams, forming engagement teams with external and internal resources and putting them up against the work that needs to be done.
Karl, I want to move us over, if I can, to, a bit of a broader discussion in terms of organizational design. I think this is a big interest of our viewers, our listeners, and I think it comes from the idea that there's a lot of discussions around how organizational systems and structures, haven't moved from their prior industrial era, purpose. And of course, so that makes sense. Our silos, our hierarchies, the command and control leadership, they tend to advocate. So I think that it's easy to see, or nearly easy to see, what it shouldn't be. I think what's hard is to anticipate, the alternative models, the alternative organizational design models, as we think about, the new ways of working in organizations going forward, so that our organizational structures aren't almost an anti-pattern, if you will, to how we're trying to get, organizations to work. So what's your opinion about organization design going forward, and any promising ideas or models that you might see there that could be contenders?
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of interesting models out there, some more advanced than others. And so, I think a couple organizations that I would point to, I'd say there are organizations that are redefining within the boundary of the organization how to organize. And I think there are actually some other trends at play that we need to consider about different ways of organizing that actually look at the boundary of the organization as more permeable. So the organizations that are doing things interestingly, and a lot of these premises have been around for a while, for over 20 years. But I would point to Hire and to Vizia as a couple of examples of organizations that are doing different things internally. And so in both of those systems, and one thing I'll say as a preface is they didn't get here through an incremental manner. It was what they're doing is revolution. It's not evolution. And so, people need to bang their heads against the wall pretty hard to shift, in these types of domains. So for Hire, they were just not fiscally viable. They just really underperforming, and the CEO knew they needed to do something different. Vizia and Hire's an appliance, consumer appliance company in China. And Vizia is, they actually provide mortgage advice. And the folks that were actually providing the advice were really frustrated by the layers of bureaucracy and how distant they were for their customers. They just said, we're fed up with this. We're going to redesign, reorganize, and do things differently. And what's similar across both those systems, I said, 20 years ago, we were talking about holacracy, which is a similar type of approach. And the idea is, how do you enable people within the organization to organize around the work to be done? So they use things like guilds and micro communities. So in the Hire example, it's these smaller communities, which if you really look at them, they're capabilities. So it might.
Oh, is that right?
Might be sales, marketing. And what they're doing is they're enabling these groups to come together, organize these capabilities against a business opportunity. And so it's a very flexible model in the sense that there are a lot of them. I think at last count, there were 4,000 of them in the organization.
Wow.
And so they take this entrepreneurial internal approach. The communities can come together, organize around what they see as a business opportunity, put together a business plan, secure investment for that. And the nice thing is they can go out and give it a try. And if it's not going well, it's pretty easy to disband and then go send their energy and their resources elsewhere. Vizi's pretty similar too. So those are ways that's a whole different approach to thinking about how you organize. And what they have in common is really strong principles and governance and guidelines. So, an example could be, Agile. You need this really strict paradigm sometimes to unleash innovation or to do things in a different way. So that's what I'd say is really interesting is it's this rules, principles, governance piece. But there's some other things that are happening out there that might completely redefine how we think about organizations. One of them is all the social stuff that we all know, which is you can't take COVID back. People have learned, people want to bring the whole selves to work. They want to do meaningful work and have impact. And they like to work remote or hybrid or things of that nature. They found that they can sometimes be more productive that way. And no amount of baby boomer CEOs telling people they have to come back to work is people aren't going to unsee that, right? So, but there are also enablers out there. There are companies like ADP and others have really advanced the ability to onboard, manage, and offboard contingent labor. So the mechanism now, from a technological perspective, is there, and so we talk a lot about the gig economy. These things become viable. Companies are experimenting a little bit internally, and I would point to talent marketplaces as an example of that. And the idea is A manager can put up a job to be done, define it in terms of the skills required, skills that someone could expect to develop in that role. And those things, we did a pilot with 5,000 people at Mars, really well accepted. But you're doing that within the context of this industrial era mindset, organization,
Structure.
structure. It's just, it can happen in these moments in time, but it's not at all an overriding organizing principle. It's just, it will be constrained. It will not redefine how work gets across the organization.
And when you're talking about the marketplace, you mean an internal talent marketplace. That's what you're referring to, and the network capabilities to do that, as well as process. Got it. Karl, what do you think about business ecosystems? Do you think that they're an alternate org structure, at a top level, or do you think that they're attributes inside, a more traditional structure? How do you see ecosystems when people talk about them?
A couple different ways. So there are existing ecosystems that people have built, or organizations have built, and I think the limiting factor is they are done with this industrial era mindset. So they're not about really mutual benefit. At the end of the day, how many times do we need to see app developers rising up against Apple, trying to take more gains out of that ecosystem they've created around apps? So there's this prevailing mindset that while we have ecosystems that are stood up in that kind of way, that doesn't embrace a more systemic, more mutual type of mindset. I think if we want to fantasize a little bit or look out into what's possible, for me, organizations, if you look out at the business ecosystem, it's a bunch of capabilities floating around. And not unlike internal to hire or Visi, how can you most efficiently and effectively bring those capabilities together to provide value? And so, we have strategic alliances, joint ventures. These are very structured, they're not really crossing boundaries. But I would say that in the future, one way that organizations may become more flexible is to get more facile and able to connect and combine their capabilities. So you may be looking out for core and necessary capabilities that support your strategic capabilities. You might want to farm out your core and necessary capabilities and monetize that because you've developed them in support of somebody else's strategic capabilities. There's a lot of different ways to go. But to do that around market opportunities and to do it in a flexible manner, it's a really interesting way to look, but it all goes back to mindset. That is not the prevailing industrial era mindset. That's really a systemic view. And what we know, actually through research, is that there's only about 11% of the managerial population that holds that mindset or can hold it. So it's really an outlier. And so we would really need to shift a lot of people's ways of thinking to a more systemic view, that view of capabilities floating out there to be combined if we were to break down the current kind of models.
So you mean, Karl, if I try to connect the dots to everything that you're saying, that the structure is less the ecosystem. The ecosystem is more of the backdrop, if you will. The structure are capabilities, and the ability to arrange those. I'll think about it, to arrange those in systemic ways as a means to drive exponential value or new value creation, if I can say it like that.
Sure.
and the juxtaposition of that, to culture with a big C in your model, culture with a big C, is, all four quadrants, but in particular, this idea of being able to bring systemic thinking, into that structure, right? That's really what it is, right? In order to create this, 1 and 1 equals 3 outcome.
Yeah. And I think it's easy in our profession because we tend to be systemic thinkers to forget that that's one of the attributes that we really bring to the table and help people is because we're able to think in those ways. But it's not that common, actually, if you look across.
Oh, I think it's one of our serious gaps, our most serious gaps when we cross clients is, this lack of capability in systems level thinking.
Yep, absolutely.
No doubt. It's a problem. And if you've never really done it as an organizational capability, it's quite a reach from here to there, given the alternatives in the current state.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. That's a hard one. So, Karl, who advocates for your function? Like, what would you say your function just would not have, the muscle that it has if it were not for, whom and who took this idea, because it's still kind of new, even just a few years ago, and really, made a long-term commitment to it that from your perspective, it's made the difference between the impact that you can have and not.
Well, we, and this is a similar model, you really need somebody who's tagged within an executive leadership team. And so that can be a formal tag. In my former employer, there were actually transformation leads. It sat on each of the executive leadership teams, and they didn't do the work that we did, but they were connected into the strategy. They had a seat at the table, things of that nature. In our current model at Mars, we're basically tied to the hip with the VPs, people in organization that sit on those executive leadership teams. So that is our entry point, because that's the system we're in, the HR system, to gain access to those teams. So they're our advocates and our champions. And as you know, it's basically a lot of it's word of mouth, right? So over time, we've built credibility, and just like, external consulting, it's your best gigs are the ones that are referred to from people that did good work before. And so it sort of builds that. So we're not just indebted to the folks in HR. It's word travels, and then people know to call us because it's a really large system and we're not that big a team. So now they're finding out about us and they're able to call us, whether it goes through HR or not.
I probably can't let you go without asking at least one question about AI. Otherwise, how would it be a conversation?
Right.
So wondering, what you're seeing in terms of impact, in your work, based on emerging frontier tech and in particular AI, becoming, such a big concern and area of focus. How does that play through to you?
Yeah, I think there's a long-term, very, very macro level view around AI that I'd like to share. And there is the short-term, the impact right now. So it's probably easy to start with the short-term. Is, AI is having and will have an impact. I think one of the things or prevailing trend I see is it really is around efficiencies, around productivity, around taking people away from these repetitive tasks, these things that can be categorized and used by AI. So that's interesting on one level. In a lot of my transformation work, we've identified, percentages of activity on people's desks that could be removed through process or design AI, things of that nature. And what I've actually seen is a prevailing preference of leaders to say, that's fantastic. And they don't steer towards headcount reduction. They steer towards what are the high value activities that we've now freed these people to go do? So, and leaders, unless it's really dire circumstances, they've, they're not all about reducing headcount. They've got a budget for it. They want to utilize it better. So those are some good things there. I think one of the other good elements of that is there's been a survey that's been deployed over a number of years. And the latest MIT Sloan Management Review, it references the survey. And what the survey has been doing is asking people, what percentage of their time are they really bringing their true talents and their expertise to bear on the job? And it's amazing how consistent the percentages is. They're falling in at 36 to 39%, which is astounding.
It really is. I didn't know that that percentage. That's very interesting stat.
Yeah. So they're saying that 70% of their time is not spent on where they can really add value. That's one way to interpret it. So AI may well be a gift. In these necessary capabilities, a lot of people are going to lose jobs, right? Because those tend to be the places that you can optimize AI. On the manufacturing level, it's going to have impact. I have a little bit of degree of, if you look at the productivity gains of the last 20 to 40 years in manufacturing, how much more can you squeeze out? And at what point are you going to get diminishing returns? Now, the other thing I want to point to is, AI from a macro level view, and we're talking about industrial revolution. Each stage of the industrial revolutions, from steam to electricity to computers, desktop computers, you've had a moment where if you leverage that new technology, there's a degree of time where you can build strategic capabilities and set yourself ahead of the group. But the time frame that lasts is diminishing more and more and more and more. So believing that you're going to get ahead of your competitors through AI and have a meaningful sustained advantage, unless you're, companies that are playing in that space or have a particular approach, it's going to be short. And so, and the other thing is with that pyramid we talked about, what strategic capabilities often migrate down to becoming core and this necessary when you've got new technologies. I think at the end of the day, AI is going to move down to that necessary piece, which is great. We're going to have more efficiencies and things like that. But for a lot of businesses, it's just going to be like any other technical innovation and things of that nature. So we're going to have major disruption around roles and headcount and things like that in the short term. But I think in the long term, things are going to level out.
And maybe see to the initial point that you were making, this optimistic impact in terms of the value, creativity, contributions of human work, especially with the percentages that we're talking about in terms of, what people really feel that they're bringing their, most critical human creativity and ideas to, right?
Yeah, and that'll bring engagement up, and that is a very, very glass half full view. Who knows?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that you'd bring my most optimistic view here, Karl, but I'll take it. So, listen, this has been a great conversation. I could go on and on. This is a topic of particular passion to me. But I want to give you a chance to leave our business leaders with any advice and counsel that you might have around, opportunities for them to think about, leveraging their organizational capabilities going forward, perhaps in ways that they're not really thinking about it today. Any words of wisdom you want to share?
Well, you probably could expect this. I think if they do really well to focus on strategic capabilities and really understand with great clarity what it is that's driving their competitive advantage in the workplace. So that's kind of the advice that I would have for most leaders. And the other part of that is we're just talking about AI. I think you've got to be really cautious about how you build expectations for AI into your forecasts. There's a lot of optimism. There's growing skepticism. Big management consulting firms are going to do and provide you advice that keeps them in your organization for as long as possible. So they're going to come with those points of view. And it probably doesn't need to be stated. It's a really good idea to do some scenario modeling. When you look at AI, figure out what you believe the trend line is, take a lower level. If things don't go that way, what's that going to look like? Take a higher level, create this band, and build all the contingency plans you need in the case that things go this way or this way versus the midway that you can project. Because people really don't know at this stage.
Yeah. It's this, I think if I turn that into a bit of methodology, I think that you're saying, I like to think about the strategic foresight methodology, Karl, where we, identify as many viable views of the future as possible. It's usually kind of a telltale sign if you've got one view of the future that's 5 years out. You got to be pretty good to hit that. So, I like the idea of these multiple, views of the future with trying to understand, what are the crossroads or signals, that you might be looking at to either adjust, leap, whatever the opportunity might be, in terms of movement. But it certainly seems that multiple views of the future and scenario planning associated with risk and probability is not necessarily the worst idea.
Yeah. And the discussions that leadership teams have around those, you're building preparedness if people are engaged and included and weighing the options and things like that. And top leaders know this, but sometimes need to be reminded that, just the practice of doing that really help your team.
I think so. Yeah. I think so. And, it's a hard thing to do. It sounds like an easy thing. It's a hard thing to do to really, both get your head around it and get consensus around it, from a diverse group of leaders. It requires a lot of mind, melding in terms of best ideas to do that anticipation in ways that people can really buy into the primary and then alternative paths.
That's right.
If you want it to mean anything, right? If you really want it to mean anything in terms of being a decision-making framework. So it's interesting to see it when it's done well. And you can understand how it's not necessarily an easy thing to do for a lot of leadership teams at the same time.
That's right.
Yeah. But that's another podcast.
Next podcast. Yeah.
That's another discussion, Karl. You're going to have to come back to talk about strategic workforce planning meets strategic foresight methodology, and that'll be a good one.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, it's been a pleasure, Mimi. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
I appreciate it. I appreciate your expertise. Yeah. I think the timing is perfect. I feel it's an area that can be real accessible to our business leaders to go think about. Probably some goodness in it. So thank you so much for your time. Good to see you, and come back again soon. I'd love to have you.
Thanks. Will do.
Thanks, Karl.